The wind moves through the ruined cloisters like a voice unburdened of time. Stones once laid by careful hands now lie cracked, invaded by moss. In the silence, one hears the echo of feet-long Gonther tread of priests, the shuffle of peasants. Kneeling on cold flagstones, the whispered prayers of souls desperate for mercy. Yet the silence is not empty. It is full of secrets. In school, we are told of cathedrals as triumphs of faith, their spires reaching heaven, their walls thick with devotion. We are taught that these were monuments to God alone, reflections of unity, of order, of progress. But the truth is far more complicated, carved not only in stone but in shadow. For every sermon sung, there were prayers whispered through fear. For every holy relic displayed, there were bones buried in silence. What the chronicles tell is one story. What the walls remember is another. Listen closely. Beneath the ringing of bells, beneath the choir, beneath the echoes of Latin hymns, there lies a deeper note, a murmur of secrecy, a weight of silence too dangerous to speak aloud. These were not the secrets of kings and wars, but of ordinary souls who lived and died unseen, whose truths could never be written in parchment. These were the secrets of the Middle Ages, the ones they never taught in school. A candle flickers in the nave. Its flame is thin, trembling, fighting the draft of the stone corridor. The wax melts slowly, pooling at the base, forming rivers of white that harden like frozen tears. A woman kneels beneath it, her veil covering her hair, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles turn pale. She does not pray for salvation. She prays that her husband's body, buried without priestly blessing beyond the city walls, might still be remembered. She whispers his name as though feeding the flame itself. This prayer will never reach the ear of a bishop. It will never be written in any book of ours. Yet it is as true as any litany. The church was a fortress of ritual, but also a vault of silence. Not all deaths could be sanctified. Those who died of plague, those who took their own lives, those deemed heretics or witches, these were buried in secret, often by night. A handful of peasants with spades, a hurried prayer, soil thrown over a body before dawn's light revealed the deed. Families carried this grief in silence, unable to speak of it without risking punishment. To the world, their dead vanished. To them, the silence was unbearable. The stone walls of the cathedral bore witness to another kind of silence, the silence of fear. There were words one could never utter aloud, doubts about relics, doubts about priests, doubts about God's justice in a world of famine and plague. To speak such thoughts was to invite suspicion, and suspicion meant trial, humiliation, even death. So the people learned to hide their voices in gestures, a hand brushing across lips to mean caution, a candle lit alone at night to mean remembrance, a loaf of bread left quietly upon a threshold to mean forgiveness unspoken. Secrets lived in these gestures, just as faith lived in the songs of the choir. Even the clergy themselves bore silence. Priests knew the hunger of their parishioners. They saw mothers bring infants too thin, saw men arrive in confession not with sins of lust or pride but with desperation. Father, forgive me, for I have stolen grain. And the priest, bound by the rituals of penance, gave them prayers instead of bread. The silence weighed heavy. To record such truths would be to admit failure. And so, the chronicles wrote of miracles, while the walls absorbed the quiet groans of the hungry. Step into the crypts, and the air thickens. Dust clings to the tongue. Candles flicker upon the faces of carved saints, their stone eyes blind to the world above. Here lie the tombs of bishops and lords, their names inscribed, their legacies eternal. Yet in corners unmarked lie bones, without names, servants, masons, those who built the cathedral but were never deemed worthy of its sanctity. Their presence was never taught. Their silence was their only memory. Outside, the bells toll. The city hears them as a call to prayer, a sign of divine order. But for many, the bells carried another message. The warning of curfew, the reminder of authority, the sound of obedience. To question the bell was to question the rhythm of God Himself. And yet, in silence, some did. One story lingers in whispers: a mason who built the high arches of a cathedral. His work rose toward heaven, but his soul was plagued with doubt. He asked quietly, too quietly for the scribes to record, "Why do we build so high while the poor starve below?" His words traveled only in murmurs, carried like smoke. The chronicles erased him, but the walls remember. Each stone he laid carries the weight of his silence. And so, the cathedral became both a beacon and a tomb. A beacon of light for those who sought salvation. A tomb of silence for those who carried truths too fragile, too dangerous, too human to be spoken. These secrets of hunger, of doubt, of grief, were as much a part of the Middle Ages as the gilded chalices or the sermons of bishops. As the chapter closes, imagine the last candle extinguished. The nave falls into darkness. The silence is absolute, save for the wind pressing against stained glass. In that silence, countless voices remain unheard, unrecorded, unteachable. They belong to the stones, to the shadows, to the centuries themselves. And as we leave the cathedral walls, we walk into another silence, the silence of hunger that echoed in fields and cottages. For beyond the walls of churches, the peasant's world carried its own secrets, hidden in mud and grain, in bread and famine. The candle dies in the cathedral, and we step outside into the cold night. The stone walls are left behind, but silence follows us into the fields. Here, there are no bells, no gilded chalices, no carved saints. Here, there is only mud. The peasants, world born in the soil, broken in the soil, and returned to the soil, was filled with secrets every bit as heavy as those carried within the church. But these were not secrets of ritual. They were secrets of survival. Listen, the earth itself holds the memory. Beneath every furrow lies a history that was never written in books, but pressed into the skin of men and women who bent beneath the weight of harvests. The chronicles speak of kings and wars, of victories and banners. But in truth, the pulse of the medieval world was measured not in battles, but in grain. A single winter of poor harvests could starve more souls than any war. Hunger was the true lord of the Middle Ages, and every household carried its dominion in silence. The secret began in the seed. A single grain could mean life or death, but not all grain could be eaten. Some must be saved, held back for planting, no matter how empty the bellies around the fire. Imagine a mother holding a small sack of rye, her children crying in the darkness, their hands reaching, their stomachs hollow. She whispers to them that there will be bread tomorrow, though she knows the sack must not be opened. To eat the seed is to end the next year before it begins. She rocks them as they cry, her own lips cracked and dry, her own hunger buried in silence. She cannot tell them the truth. That silence was one of the greatest burdens of the peasant's life. The fields, too, carried unspoken rules. Grain was measured, counted, weighed, taxed. Lords demanded their share first, priests demanded their tithe second, and what remained trickled into the huts of peasants, it was never enough. And yet, the chronicles describe the peasants' world as one of obedience, as if hunger itself was obedience. They do not describe the nights when a man crept into the Lord's granary, moving like a shadow, praying no one heard the crunch of straw beneath his feet. If caught, his punishment could be whipping, mutilation, even death. Yet still they went, because hunger speaks louder than law. These thefts were the hidden rhythm of medieval survival, but they were never written in parchment. They lived only in whispers, in shadows, in the silence between bells, and there was another silence, the silence of famine. When crops failed, the land itself seemed cursed. Fields stood empty, stalks blackened by blight, rivers ran low, livestock fell sick. Famine crept not with a roar but with a whisper, a slow hollowing of villages, a quiet that stretched over weeks until voices grew weak. A child too tired to cry, a man too weak to lift his plow. The silence of famine was different from any other silence. It was a silence that seemed to stop time. We read in records of the Great Famine of 1315, but the numbers do not describe the sound of it the way bread crusts were boiled into water to make them last, the way bark was stripped from trees, the way horses were eaten until none remained. And darker still, the whispers that some turned to flesh itself, the last taboo, hidden even from confession. The chronicles will never tell us their names, but the soil remembers. Every famine left behind a silence that could never be spoken of again. There were secrets in the grain itself. Bread was not only food, it was faith. To break bread was to share in Christ's body, and yet bread was also taxed, measured, policed. Millers kept secrets of their own, accused of stealing grain from the poor, of grinding too little, of weighing falsely. The people whispered about them, cursed them under breath, and sometimes rose against them in fury. In France, there are stories of peasants storming mills, drowning millers in the rivers they used. These acts were never called rebellion, they were hunger given voice. And yet, in official records, they were erased, softened, forgotten. Hunger's secrets were buried as quickly as the dead. But hunger did not only kill, it shaped lives, families, bartered daughters for grain. Promises of marriage were broken when famine came. Mothers chose which child would eat first. Fathers chose which field to till while their bodies collapsed from weakness. The chronicles do not write of these choices. They write of kings, of battles, of banners. But here, in the cottages, the true wars were fought in silence, with empty stomachs and hidden tears. One story drifts through the smoke of memory. A boy, no more than 10, carrying a single loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. His father had stolen it from the granary. They ate only half. The boy was told to bring the other half to the church as offering, to thank God for mercy. He walked barefoot, the bread warm in his hands. When he reached the church, the priest unwrapped it, sniffed it, and said, "This is coarse, unworthy." The boy lowered his eyes, burning with shame, too hungry to understand. That night, his family ate nothing. Such were the silent humiliations of hunger, hidden beneath the sermons of plenty. The grain fields themselves were like a second church. In them, rituals were performed that were never sanctioned by bishops. Women tied ribbons around stalks, whispering prayers that the crop would stand against storms. Men lit small fires at the edge of the furrows to drive away evil spirits. These were not written in holy books. These were survival's prayers, taught by ancestors, whispered in secret. The church called them superstition. But when the harvest was in danger, no one cared for doctrine. Faith bent toward hunger. And so, The fields carried their own religion, hidden one woven into the soil itself. Seeds were holy. Bread was sacred. Hunger was a god to be appeased, not conquered. And silence was its scripture. To speak too loudly of it was to invite fear, suspicion, punishment. And so they spoke of it in gestures, in rituals, in whispers. The chronicles never recorded these things, but the soil remembers. The wind remembers. As night falls, picture a cottage lit by one dying fire. A mother lies awake, listening to her children's breath, shallow, restless. Outside, the wind rattles the thatch, carrying with it the sound of distant bells. She closes her eyes and dreams of bread, not of heaven, not of glory, not of saints, but of bread. That was her prayer, her secret. That was her Middle Ages. And as the fire turns to ash and silence fills the room, another silence grows. Outside, the silence of disease, of plague, of the death cart that would one day roll down. The same muddy lanes where hunger reigned. Hunger was only the beginning. The silence of plague would be far darker. The wind moves across the fields. The last embers of a cottage fire glow, and within, a mother prays for bread. But outside, another silence grows darker, heavier, stranger. It is the silence that comes not from hunger, but from death. At first it was only a cough, a sound no different from the coughs that filled every winter night when smoke clung low to the roofs and children huddled beneath coarse wool blankets. But soon the cough lingered, deepened, became something else. Then came swellings, black as ink, rising beneath the skin like curses written in flesh. Within days, a man strong enough to lift a plough could not lift a cup of water. Within a week, he was gone. And where he lay, no one dared linger. The chronicles called it pestilence, the great mortality, the Black Death. But in the cottages, no one spoke such words. They called it the silence. For once it entered a house, laughter never returned. Doors were marked with painted crosses, curtains were drawn, and the only sound left within was breathing and then nothing. Imagine the streets of a village. Chickens wander untended. Dogs howl and tear at abandoned bread loaves. The bell tolls again and again until its voice itself seems broken. Numbered market stalls. No children's games. Just wind moving through empty lanes, rattling shutters against rotting wood. The silence of plague was not absence, it was present. It pressed against the chest, filled the air, sat in every doorway. We are told in parchment records of numbers, 1/3 of Europe dead, entire towns erased. But numbers cannot hold the sound of it. The sudden scream when a mother found her child. Cold at dawn, the thud of a body dragged across dirt floors. The shovels striking frozen ground when there were too many dead for coffins. In the chronicles, these are statistics. In the soil, they are wounds. In cities, the silence grew into chaos. Priests carried candles down alleys, whispering last rites through windows, too afraid to enter. Monks wrote hurried prayers, their ink smeared by fevered hands. In Florence, they say carts rolled through the streets, piled high with corpses. The air so thick with stench that birds no longer circled overhead. In London, men set fires in hopes the smoke would purify the air. But the smoke only choked them more. In Paris, the Seine ran heavy with ashes. So many clothes and beds burned that the river itself seemed to carry mourning. And yet, even in silence, suspicion found its voice. Some whispered that Jews poisoned wells, that foreigners carried curses, that beggars spread the rot. In Strasbourg, they dragged hundreds of Jews into the square, burning them alive in fire meant to cleanse the city. Mothers wept as their children screamed, the plague taking one life by fire and another by fever. Such was the madness that silence left behind. It made enemies where there were none. But not all were accused. Some believed the plague was God's punishment for sin. Men and women walked barefoot, lashing their own backs with whips, their blood staining the stones, their cries rising through the smoke. Flagellants, they were called pilgrims of pain, marching through villages where even priests trembled. At night they lay in barns, their bodies raw, their prayers dripping with blood. To them, silence was not the end, but the proof of God's wrath. And still, in the cottages, mothers prayed for bread, even as the cough entered their homes. Some buried their children in shallow graves, too weak to dig deeper. Others sat beside them until breath fled both at once. Whole families vanished in silence, their huts collapsing into soil. The chronicles do not name them, but the fields remember where their bodies lay. There are darker secrets, too. When the death carts came, some bribed the drivers to carry away the sick who still breathed, for they feared contagion more than cruelty. Men who had not yet died were thrown among corpses, their cries muffled beneath shrouds. The cart rattled on, and their voices faded into the silence of mass graves. These things were not confessed, not written, but the earth remembers. And yet, in silence, there were moments of devotion. A wife who lay beside her husband, though she knew she would die by dawn. A priest who refused to leave the side of plague-ridden children, even as his own skin blackened. In Siena, a nurse wrote of carrying bread from door to door, knowing each knock might be her last. These acts did not survive in chronicles as grand tales of kings. They survived in whispers, in parish notes, in nameless graves. Acts of love in the shadow of silence. The plague did not simply kill, it changed time itself. Bells tolled until the ropes frayed. Funerals were shortened. Prayers were spoken quickly, or not at all. Time was measured not in days, but in deaths. And when the plague moved on, the survivors lived in its silence still. A man who had buried 5 children did not laugh again. A woman who had lost her husband did not remarry. Villages stood half empty, their fields gone wild, their wells dry. Even when life returned, it carried the silence of plague within it. Picture the end of winter, when the frost begins to crack. Survivors step into the fields, weak, thin, haunted. They carry seed, but their hands tremble. They remember the coughing, the blackened skin, the graves, and yet they plant, not because hope is strong, but because hunger is stronger. The silence of plague gives way to the silence of hunger again. And so the cycle turns, but plague left behind something else, too. A question. Why had God allowed such silence? Priests offered answers, sin, wrath, penance, but not all believed them. Some whispered that God himself had abandoned the world. That silence was proof not of punishment, but of absence. This thought was darker than plague itself, and it spread, quietly, like a shadow in the heart. From this silence, doubt began to grow. Doubt that would one day split Christendom itself. The silence of plague was never just death. It was memory. It lingered in villages long after the coughing stopped. It lived in the earth, in the bones beneath the fields, in the bells that tolled too long. And it set the stage for new silences of war, of heresy, of rebellion. For when hunger and plague had broken the body, only the spirit remained to be broken. And so, as the last plague cart rattles down the road, its wheels crunching the frozen earth, we follow it into the next silence. The silence of heresy, where words themselves became more dangerous than swords. The silence left by plague had hardly faded when another silence began to spread. Not the silence of death, nor of hunger, but the silence of fear. Fear of words, fear of thoughts spoken in whispers, fear of names carved into parchment, carried into darkness. It began with questions. Questions born not from rebellion, but from grief. Why had God abandoned them? Why had prayers not lifted the pestilence from their homes? Why had priests grown fat while villagers starved? These questions, fragile as candle flames, flickered in taverns, in workshops, in the secret corners of monasteries, and like candle flames, they were easily blown out, snuffed, not by wind, but by fire. For in this new silence, fire became the answer. Fire that licked the night sky in village squares. Fire that turned men and women into blackened shadows. Fire that consumed parchment and voices alike. Heresy, they called it. The crime of believing differently, of doubting too loudly, of breathing questions into air that could not hold them. Picture the square at dawn. Frost still clings to the stones. A crowd gathers, huddled in cloaks. At the center stands a wooden stake, its base wrapped in straw. Bound to it, a figure, sometimes a scholar, sometimes a peasant, sometimes a woman who had simply whispered too much. Their breath rises in the cold air, their eyes searching the crowd for mercy that will not come. And then the torch is lowered. The silence shatters in screams, in crackling wood, in the rush of flame. We are told that this was justice, that heretics threatened the soul of Christendom, that fire purified. But what was burned was not only Bodhisattva, was memory, thought, the possibility of another truth. What survived was silence. The Inquisition moved like a shadow across Europe. In the cloisters of Paris, friars debated the nature of God, while, in cellars beneath, prisoners lay chained in darkness, their backs marked by iron. In Spain, tribunals filled the air with the smell of ink and fear. In Germany, men whispered of sects who gathered in barns, reading scripture in their own tongue. And everywhere, torches burned. The records speak of trials, interrogations where men in robes asked questions that had no safe answers. Do you deny the church? Do you hold secret scriptures? Do you believe bread and wine to be mere bread and wine? Questions sharpened like swords, ready to cut either way. And when silence fell too long, the racks spoke in place of words. But heresy was not only found in words, it was found in hunger. A man who cursed God over an empty field was guilty. A woman who healed with herbs instead of holy water was guilty. A monk who doubted the wealth of his abbot was guilty. The line between faith and heresy was drawn not in truth, but in fear. And yet, even in fear, voices rose. John Wycliffe, in England, who dared say that the Bible belonged not only to priests, but to every soul who could read. Jan Hus, in Bohemia, who cried that Christ, not the Pope, was head of the church. Their words spread like seeds on the wind seeds watered by blood. Hus was burned in 1415, his ashes scattered in the Rhine, his voice silenced in flame. But his followers swore that his spirit would rise again, and in time it did. Imagine the hush of a secret gathering. A candle flickers against a wall. A man reads from a parchment hidden beneath his cloak. The words are in the tongue of the people, not in Latin. The listeners lean close, their faces shadowed. Each syllable is both a gift and a death sentence. Outside, footsteps echo. The candle is snuffed. Silence. The fear was not only for oneself. Fathers turned in sons. Wives betrayed husbands. Neighbors whispered names to avoid suspicion falling on their own door. Silence became survival. For to remain silent when accused was dangerous, but to speak was worse. Words could betray you, twist against you, become the rope around your neck. And so, silence was learned. Whole villages spoke in half sentences, their thoughts buried deeper than graves. But silence could not last forever. Fire, after all, is not only destruction, it is also light. The more the church burned, the more people saw what it feared. They saw its fear of questions, its fear of truth, its fear that silence could not hold forever. And so, whispers grew. Doubts deepened. In time, silence became murmur, murmur became word, and word became movement. Still, in these centuries, the price of speech was death. The chronicles tell us of men marched barefoot through streets, their tongues cut out before the fire consumed them. Of women paraded with crowns of paper painted in demons, condemned for the crime of knowing too much. Of parchment torn from scholars' hands, their ink stains erased in ash dot, and yet, beneath this fire, another silence smoldered. The silence of books hidden in cellars, the silence of prayers whispered in native tongues, the silence of peasants who refused to bow to priests, even as they knelt at altars. This silence did not die in fire. It waited. The silence of heresy was not the silence of plague, nor of hunger. It was a silence chosen, a silence heavy with words unsaid, words burning inside the chest. It was the silence of those who could not yet speak, but would one day roar. Picture the last image. A girl, no older than 12, clutching a hidden scrap of parchment. Her father has been taken, her mother burned. She kneels in a field, pressing the words to her chest, whispering them not to the crowd, not to the priests, but to the soil itself. Her voice is quiet, but the soil hears. The soil remembers, and from this soil, watered with fire and silence, something new will grow. Rebellion, war, whole nations rising. The silence of heresy will give way to the roar of steel. It begins not with words, but with footsteps. The tramp of boots upon frozen earth, the shuffle of peasants clutching pikes sharpened from farm tools, the steady beat of drums echoing across valleys. War, once the distant thunder of kings, now marched through the fields of the common man. The silence of heresy had smoldered long enough. Whispers had gathered like storm clouds. Now the storm broke. Steel was its voice. In the hills of Bohemia, men gathered beneath banners marked not with lions or crowns, but with chalices, the cup of Christ, claimed as their own. They were peasants, artisans, widows who had lost too much to silence. They carried flails, scythes, and faith sharper than swords. Against them rode armored knights, lances gleaming, shields emblazoned with the coats of kings. The clash was uneven, yet the earth shook with it. Steel met flesh, hooves trampled wheat fields. Smoke rose from villages torched for defiance. And still the rebels fought. For every heretic burned, 10 rose with pikes. For every village silenced, another whispered louder. The silence of fire had become the roar of war. Picture the battlefield at dawn. Mist curls low, hiding corpses left from the night. Crows gather. A boy no older than 16 grips a halberd, his hands blistered. his breath shaking. Across from him stands a knight, visor down, sword gleaming. Between them lies not only steel, but centuries of order, the gulf between noble and peasant, priest and heretic, ruler and ruled. The knight lowers his lance. The boy does not run. This was the birth of a new truth, that steel could be taken from lords, wielded by those who had been voiceless. That faith, once policed by fire, could be defended by blade. But war is never clean. Villages that once whispered prayers now screamed with burning. Churches became fortresses, altars overturned into barricades. The chalice, symbol of hope, was carried as a banner through blood-soaked mud. What had begun as a cry for faith became a war for survival, and survival leaves no innocence untouched. The chronicles speak of sieges, castles starved into surrender, their wells poisoned, their gates battered by rams fashioned from oak. Inside, mothers soothed their children with dry lips, telling them to swallow the hunger. Outside, men froze in armor, their beards crusted with frost, their bellies empty but their eyes full of rage. Arrows darkened the sky like locusts. When gates fell, mercy rarely entered with the victors. Steel brought not only rebellion, but kings' ambitions. Monarchs saw in this chaos the chance to expand their borders, to claim the faith of their neighbors as pretext for conquest. War spread like a plague of iron. France, England, the empire each bled men into the earth, each crowned fields with crosses of bone. And yet, in this furnace, something new was forged. For centuries, the knight had been the symbol of power mounted, armored, invincible. But now, peasants armed with longbows and gunpowder began to unmake that image. At Crécy, at Agincourt, arrows fell like rain, piercing steel. At Hussite wars, wagon forts turned peasants into walls of death. The age of the knight was ending. The age of war without honor had begun. Still, to those who lived through it, war was not strategy, but survival. Imagine a widow hiding her child beneath floorboards as soldiers ransack her cottage. Imagine a monk clutching relics to his chest as flames consume his chapel. Imagine the silence after battle, when the only sound is the buzzing of flies over the unburied dead. These were the true hymns of steel sung not by kings, but by the broken. Yet even war could not silence hope. Between battles, men carved prayers into their shields. Women stitched charms into their husbands' cloaks. Priests, once feared as inquisitors, now marched with the poor, carrying not crosses of gold but wood. They whispered that God was not only in Rome, not only in crowns, but in every cry for justice. Steel gave those cries teeth, and so the continent bled. War became not an exception, but a season. Children were born into it, grew into it, died in it, never knowing peace. To live was to march, to starve, to swing blade or fall before it. Whole generations became shadows moving through smoke. But in the ashes of these wars, something irreversible was born. The silence of heresy had become the roar of steel, and the roar could not be contained. It would echo into reforms, revolutions, nations rising. The fire that once burned books now burned borders. The torch of faith had become the cannon of kingdoms. Picture the last image, a blacksmith's forge deep in night. Sparks leap as hammer strikes iron. The man shaping the steel does not know whose hand will wield it. A peasant's, a king's, a heretic's, or a conqueror's. All he knows is that the world has changed. Silence has been broken. The age of war and steel has begun. It begins in silence again, not the silence of prayer, nor the silence of corpses on the battlefield, but the hushed stillness of a chamber at midnight. A single candle gutters on a table, its wax dripping like blood frozen in time. Two figures lean close, voices barely audible, their words too dangerous for daylight. A servant lingers at the door, pretending to sleep, though his ears drink in every syllable. What is spoken here will decide the fate of thousands beyond the stone walls. This was the other face of power in the medieval world. Not the clash of steel, not the banners in the wind, but the whispered bargains and betrayals made in darkness. Wars may have been fought by knights, but they were begun by secrets in chambers like these. Behind every crown sat a shadow. Behind every throne, a whisper. Behind every banquet, a knife. Picture a hall lined with tapestries. The nobles' feast, goblets brimming, laughter loud enough to seem honest. But watch closely, see the queen glance to her steward, see the king's brother pass a folded note beneath the table, see the bishop murmur a prayer not to God but to his own survival. Each smile is armor, each toast is a blade. In such halls, loyalty was not measured in years, but in breaths. The chronicles tell us of kings who wore rings poisoned on the inside, so that one wrong gesture could end them. Of queens who hid letters in their hair braids, passing secret words to lovers or allies. Of envoys who carried messages sewn into the lining of their cloaks, and who vanished into dungeons when discovered. The age of shadows was not less bloody than the age of war. It was simply quieter. Betrayal thrived where crowns glittered. Brothers murdered brothers for inheritance. Sons plotted against fathers, eager for the throne. Queens, married as pawns, turned their beds into battlegrounds, wielding silence, influence, and seduction as weapons sharper than swords. Consider the banquet of roses in England, where cousins sat smiling across tables, though each plotted the other's death, or the poisoned chalice in Italy, where a duke's feast became a grave. These were not tales whispered to frighten children. These were the truths of power. In such courts, truth itself was dangerous. To speak openly was to invite ruin. Better to learn the art of masks. Better to bow while planning rebellion. Better to kiss the ring while slipping poison into the wine. It was said that the safest man in a king's court was not the most loyal, but the best liar. But shadows did not belong only to kings. Spies moved through markets and monasteries alike. A beggar with torn cloak could carry messages between armies. A monk could pen treachery in the margins of a psalm. A servant, invisible, in silence, could know more than any lord. Thrones rose and fell not only by battles, but by the words overheard in kitchens, the glances caught by watchful eyes, and always there was the crown, heavy, glittering, fragile, to where it was to live in constant fear of those who wanted it. Next, few kings slept soundly, few queens dined without tasting suspicion in every bite. Some locked themselves in chambers, eating only what they prepared with their own hands. Others trusted only tasters, who often died first. Even feasts, the grandest symbols of wealth, became theaters of terror. Yet amidst the fear, ambition burned brighter than caution. Every noble dreamed of a crown, or at least of marrying one. Girls of 12 were betrothed to men thrice their age, their wombs turned into tools of dynasty. Boys were trained not only with swords, but with smiles, when to bend the knee, when to bear the blade. Families played a game older than steel. one whose board was Europe itself. The pieces were human lives, and the church knew these shadows well. Popes crowned kings and stripped crowns away. Bishops whispered to queens. Confessors carried secrets more powerful than armies. In every coronation there was suspicion. In every prayer, a hint of strategy. To hold a crown without the church's blessing was to sit on a throne of sand. Still, crowns glittered, and men died for them. Castles filled with silk and gold could not protect a king from a knife in the dark. Palaces echoed with music, even as their cellars hid screams of prisoners. Above the laughter of courtiers, the sound of betrayal was always near. Imagine, then, the candlelit chamber again. Two figures bent close, speaking words never meant for parchment. A pact is sealed not with a sword's clash, but with a handshake. In shadow, outside, the wind howls through battlements, and the guard stamps his feet for warmth, knowing nothing of the kingdom's fate being written inside. This was the other war of the medieval world. Not armies, but shadows. Not swords, but secrets. And as the candle dies, its smoke curling like a ghost into the rafters, the chamber falls dark. The secret is swallowed by the stone. Tomorrow, men will die for it, never knowing why. The age of shadows and crowns was not an age of peace, it was simply an age where death came dressed in velvet. And so, the story bends. From war's thunder to silence once more. From battlefields to banquet halls. From steel to whispers. But whispers, like steel, cut deep. They would shape dynasties. They would end dynasties. They would prepare the stage for the next secret one. Hidden not in crowns, but in flesh itself. For what man feared more than kings or armies was the enemy within his own blood. The shadow of pestilence. The silence of the plague. It begins with a cough. A sound so small, so ordinary, that none notice it at first. It rattles in the chest of a merchant returning from a journey, lingers in the throat of a beggar sleeping in straw, echoes in the silence of a candlelit church, and then the cough multiplies. House to house, mouth to mouth, breath to breath, it spreads like shadow, faster than rumor, hungrier than war. The chronicles tell us of armies, of crowns, of treason, but what they could not control, what no sword nor prayer could ever hold back, was the creeping silence of pestilence. The medieval world was not only haunted by wars and betrayals, but by a fear deeper, darker, invisible. Death walked then not as a knight in armor, but as a breath in the dark. Picture a village at dusk. Smoke rises from chimneys. Children laugh in the mud. Women knead bread. Men return from fields. Life is poor, but steady. And then, without warning, the door of one cottage is marked with a red cross. The sound of hammering fills the air, not for building, not for war, but for sealing a family inside. Neighbors whisper, children are told not to look, but all know. Plague has entered their street. From that moment, silence grows. Windows close. Prayers are whispered more urgently. The smell of herbs, vinegar, and smoke fills the lanes as desperate hands try to cleanse the air. Bells toll not for weddings, but for burials. And each dawn, a cart rolls through the village, its wooden wheels groaning beneath the weight of bodies. The driver calls, not for bread, not for ale, but for the dead. Bring out your dead. 3 words repeated until they became the song of entire cities. No crown could command the pestilence to stop. Kings fled castles only to find death waiting in the countryside. Priests gave last rites until their lips cracked, and then received the rites themselves. Graveyards filled so quickly that corpses were thrown into pits. limes scattered over them like flour upon dough. Wolves crept near cities, drawn by the scent of flesh, and still the bells tolled, day after day, louder than prayer, louder than song. Those who survived wrote of sights no man should see, of mothers abandoning children, children abandoning mothers, of priests confessing sins in empty churches because none were left to hear them, of doctors with long-beaked masks filled with herbs and vinegar, standing like birds of omen above the dying. These were not healers, but witnesses, scribes of despair. Fear changed everything. Neighbors ceased to speak. Lovers ceased to touch. The handshake, once a symbol of trust, became a risk of death. Entire villages vanished, doors swinging open to the wind, hearths cold, animals roaming freely through silent lanes. Travelers came upon towns where only the crows remained, feasting in the silence, and faith, too, cracked beneath the weight of pestilence. Some prayed louder, lashing their own backs until they bled, hoping pain might purchase mercy. Others cursed God, spitting on the ground, believing no heaven could allow such horror. The church itself trembled, as priests died faster than their congregations. Even the holiest relics seemed powerless, but not all was silence. In the chaos, new shadows moved. Some profited grave diggers who charged coin for every pit, merchants who sold false cures, nobles who seized lands abandoned by plague-dead families. Others turned to blame, hunting strangers, burning outsiders, slaughtering those accused of poisoning wells. Fear bred cruelty, and the pestilence feasted on both body and soul. Yet still, amidst the terror, there was resilience. Not every song was silenced. Some mothers sang lullabies to children, even as coughs rattled in their lungs. Some priests carried the host to the dying, knowing it would cost them their own breath. Some lovers defied fear, clinging to one another in plague-filled nights, whispering that death could not separate what life had joined. Imagine, then, the city square. The pit yawns wide, smoke rising from lime-covered bodies. The air stinks of death, and yet a single child kneels by the edge, placing a flower upon the mound. She knows it will wither by morning, but still she leaves it because love refuses silence, even in the reign of pestilence. The secrets of plague were not only in death, but in what it revealed. It unmasked kings as powerless, priests as mortal, cities as fragile. It showed that beneath crowns and swords, beneath castles and armies, all were equal in the face of breath and shadow. It whispered that no man, no woman, no child was safe. But it also showed something else, that the human heart, though fragile, was not so easily destroyed. That songs still rose through the silence, prayers still lifted through despair, hands still reached for one another in the dark. And so the bells tolled, not only for the dead, but for the living who refused to surrender their voices. The pestilence passed, as all storms do, but it left scars deeper than wounds. It carved itself into memory, into prayer, into the very stones of Europe. Villages were left hollow, families erased, dynasties ended. Yet the world endured, and as the last cart rolled away, as the last pit was filled, as the last cough faded into the silence, the survivors looked upon a changed world. They had seen death not as an enemy in armor, but as a shadow in breath. They had learned that life was fragile, fleeting, and precious. The story bends again, from shadows of crowns to the silence of plague, from whispers of betrayal to the roar of empty bells. Yet beyond plague, another secret waits, one not carried by air, but written in books, whispered by scholars, hidden in monasteries. A secret of ink, parchment, and forbidden knowledge. The age of pestilence gave way to the age of ideas. The silence of death would give birth to voices unafraid to question, and in those voices, the seeds of change began to stir. It begins not with steel, nor with the tolling of bells, but with the scratch of a quill. A feather dipped in ink, trembling over parchment, whispering lines into silence. After plague, after pestilence, the world was scarred. Villages emptied, churches hollowed, graves filled. Yet in the silence that followed death, another hunger awoke. A hunger not for bread, not for coin, but for meaning. Men and women, haunted by loss, began to seek answers not in bells, nor relics, nor kings. They searched in words, but words could be dangerous. Picture the cloister of a monastery. Torches flicker. Monks bend over desks, copying texts by hand, each letter a prayer, each margin decorated with vines of ink. The smell of parchment and wax fills the air. Silence is broken only by the rhythm of quills and the distant chant of midnight prayers. Here, knowledge was chained, guarded, locked within stone walls. To copy a book was to labor for months, sometimes years, and each page was guarded like treasure, for knowledge was as precious as gold, but not all knowledge was welcome. The church decided which books could be copied, which thoughts could be spoken. Words that questioned, words that strayed from the narrow road of doctrine were hidden, burned, or whispered only in secret. To read the wrong text was not merely curiosity, was heresy, and heresy was a crime that burned. Yet still, the whispers spread. A farmer's son who learned to read might find scraps of text, folded and smuggled beneath a cloak. A wandering scholar might carry a book from distant lands, bound in strange leather, filled with ideas forbidden at home. Merchants carried not only spices and silk, but manuscripts, fragments of ancient Rome, echoes of lost Greece, wisdom, thought, long dead. These texts passed like contraband, hand to hand, mouth to mouth, and with them came questions that struck deeper than any sword. What if the earth was not the center? What if kings ruled not by divine right, but by force? What if truth lay not in relics, but in reason? Such questions could shatter thrones. The secrets of forbidden knowledge were not shouted, but whispered in the shadows. In taverns, scholars argued in hushed voices, careful of listening ears. In cellars, parchments were hidden beneath floorboards. In universities rising in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, students debated truths that priests forbade, and yet knowledge had a cost. Consider the heretic before the crowd, accused of reading what was not permitted. His hands bound, his books burned before his eyes. The pyre weights would stacked high. The people watch, torn between fear and curiosity. His crime was not theft, not murder, but words. Words that unsettled the powerful, words that loosened chains. And so the fire consumes him, and the smoke carries his voice to the heavens. But fire cannot burn thought. Even as ashes fell, new quills scratched parchment. New whispers crossed borders. Some monks, sworn to silence, secretly copied the forbidden texts at night, hiding them beneath altars, burying them in walls. Some scholars fled cities, carrying books sewn into cloaks, risking death for knowledge. And across the Mediterranean, in lands the church called foreign, libraries flourished. In Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Cairo, vast halls brimmed with texts of Science, medicine, philosophy, knowledge, the West had forgotten. Travelers carried fragments back, translations that cracked open doors, long sealed. In their ink, Europe glimpsed truths it had buried. But every truth is a spark, and sparks can set kingdoms aflame. The rulers knew this. Kings feared that ideas might unseat crowns. Priests feared that questions might unseat faith. And so knowledge was chained, literally chained to desks, bound to stone walls, so none could carry it away. But chains could not hold curiosity in the flicker of candlelight. A boy leaned over a page, lips whispering words never meant for him. A girl, taught only to spin wool, stole glances at letters her brother scratched. In the hunger of their eyes, the old order trembled, because knowledge was not a weapon of steel. It was slower, quieter, sharper. It carved not flesh, but thought. And once a mind was cut open, it could never be closed again. Imagine a scholar in a tower, alone, staring at the stars. His parchment is filled with circles and numbers, heresies drawn in ink. He knows if discovered, he will burn, yet he cannot stop, for he has seen something the priests cannot explain. Patterns in the heavens, order in the chaos, truth beyond doctrine. He whispers to himself, and the ink becomes prophecy. And still, the fires burned. Heretics screamed. Books turned to ash, libraries to smoke. But always, someone remembered a line, a phrase, a thought. Words survived in fragments, in whispers. In memory, they leaped from tongue to tongue, heart to heart, surviving where parchment could not. It was said that knowledge is power. But in the medieval world, knowledge was more than power. It was danger. It was rebellion. It was the breath of freedom, pressed between two boards of leather. The secrets of forbidden knowledge did not remain hidden forever. In time, the whispers grew into voices, the voices into books, the books into movements. And kings who once burned heretics found themselves overthrown not by swords, but by words. From plague and silence, humanity had learned the fragility of life. From forbidden knowledge, it would learn the fragility of power. And so the story bends again. From pits of death to the flicker of ink, from bells tolling for the dead to whispers that defied crowns. But ink was not the only secret of that age. There were other shadows, darker still. Shadows of torture, of chains, of dungeons where screams were silenced by stone. The age of forbidden words would give way to the age of iron hands. And the next secret would not be written in ink, but in blood. It begins with a scream, not the wild cry of battle, nor the mourning wail of plague. This scream is caged, muffled by stone, rising from the belly of a dungeon. The medieval world was built on belief in order. God above, king below him, peasant beneath both. To keep this order, justice had to be seen, and punishment had to echo. The sword might cut down one man, but fear could bind 1,000. And so torture was not hidden, it was ritual, theater, instruction. Step into the dungeon. The air is thick with rot, mold, and smoke from torches that never die. Chains dangle from walls slick with damp. The floor is mud and blood, hardened into a black crust. Every sound is magnified, the drip of water, the rattle of iron, the groan of prisoners who will never see the sun again. A man kneels in chains, accused of heresy or theft or treason. He has not yet been judged guilty. In fact, torture is part of his trial. Pain itself is the judge, the inquisitor, the confessor. For in the medieval world, truth was believed to lie in suffering. If he screams out a confession, then he has admitted guilt. If he holds his silence, perhaps God shields him. But few men can endure the wheel, the rack, the boots. Truth, in such places, bends under fire and iron. Consider the rack. 4 ropes, 1 at each limb. A crank turns, and joints begin to stretch, sinews tearing, bones creaking. The sound is like wood splitting in a winter fire. His mouth opens, and the chamber fills with words sometimes true, sometimes false, always broken. Or the wheel, a great cartwheel mounted on a pole. The condemned man is tied to it, arms and legs spread like a grotesque crucifix. An iron bar smashes his bones, one after another, until his body is a map of fractures. Left there for crows, he becomes both warning and spectacle. The people pass beneath, crossing themselves, whispering prayers, glancing with fear at their children. Justice is no longer private, it is a sermon. But not all punishments ended in death. Some were designed to mark the body, to inscribe guilt into flesh. A thief might lose a hand. A liar might have his tongue cut. A slanderer's lips branded with iron. The punishment lived on in scars, so that every passerby could read a man's past in his skin. And there were punishments meant not for the body, but for the spirit. Imagine the shame mask, an iron cage fitted over the head, grotesquely shaped like a pig, a demon, or a fool. It clanged with bells, drawing every eye as the punished walked through the town. Laughter could wound deeper than whips. Humiliation was a sentence as lasting as iron. Inquisitors believed that pain was holy. They called torture the question for. Every turn of the rack was a question asked of the flesh, and every scream an answer. Men of God stood with quills in hand, recording the words of the broken as if they were gospel. The chamber of torture was not chaos, but ritual, watched over by priests who prayed as joints cracked and torches burned. And yet, beneath this theater of justice, there was something darker. Torture was not only about truth, it was about power. It was about showing the strength of crown and church, reminding all who watched that rebellion was folly, that thought itself could be punished. The body of one was sacrificed to preserve the obedience of many. Still, the people came. They crowded into squares when executions were announced. Bells tolled, trumpets blared, and the condemned was paraded through the streets. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Old women clutched rosaries. Beggars reached for crumbs. And when the axe fell or the flames rose, silence fell over the crowd, followed by a roar. Justice was a spectacle as binding as any sermon. Some punishments were almost theatrical in cruelty. The scold's bridle a cage of iron fitted to the head, with a spiked plate that pressed down upon the tongue. Worn by women accused of gossip or witchcraft, it silenced them by turning every word into pain. Or the ordeal by water. A woman bound and cast into a river. If she sank, she was innocent but drowned. If she floated, she was guilty and burned. Justice was twisted into paradox, but belief was stronger than reason. And yet listen closer. In the cracks of screams, there were murmurs. Not everyone believed. Some whispered that the innocent suffered. Some said the rack broke more truth than it revealed. And some, watching bodies burn in the square, asked whether this was truly God's will, or the cruelty of men cloaked in robes of faith. Still, the machine of fear turned on, because fear was currency. Fear bound peasants to lords, lords to kings, kings to church. And fear, once planted, grew deeper than loyalty. But the strange truth is this: torture did not always silence. Sometimes it spread. The memory of screams lingered in villages for decades. Children who had watched grew into adults who remembered, and in their memory, power lost its mask. They saw not justice, but cruelty, not order, but tyranny, and seeds of rebellion took root. For even in the darkest chambers, humanity endured. A prisoner might carve his name into stone with fingernails, leaving a fragment of himself behind. A mother might smuggle bread into the dungeon for her son. A condemned man, moments before the blade, might raise his eyes to the sky and whisper not confession, but defiance. And so torture, meant to silence, sometimes gave birth to voices louder than fire. The medieval world is remembered for its swords, its castles, its plagues. But beneath it all, it was held together by fear. And fear had its theater in chains, racks, and fire. This was justice, medieval and merciless. A justice not of mercy, but of spectacle. Yet even fear has limits. Even terror, wielded too long, begins to crack. And out of dungeons, from ashes, from whispers, there came a question that no rack could break, no wheel could silence. What if justice belonged not to kings and priests, but to the people themselves? The age of torture was not the end. It was a shadow. And beyond that shadow, change stirred.